80 Days, adventurer and award-winning filmmaker Paul G. Roberts retraces the global footsteps of Phileas Fogg, hero of Jules Verne's most famous work.
When one hears the name Laos or Laos, people immediately think of two things, or at least I do. The first being, it's the Golden Triangle. And the second, the massive, millions of tons of bombs that were dropped through covert operations on Laos during the Vietnam War. And legend has it, the name actually refers to when gold was used by Chinese traders to pay for opium that was being grown there. Now, the Golden Triangle is the area where borders Thailand, Laos, and Myanmar, and they meet at the confluence of the Mekong and the Ruak rivers. And the name, the Golden Triangle, was also apparently coined by the CIA and used more broadly to define that territory, which is approximately 950 square kilometres of mountains in the three adjacent countries. So it's a massive, inhospitable area, and obviously fantastic for clandestine, secret goings-on, like growing opium or manufacturing meth, which has become a really important thing to the area now.
But the Golden Triangle's warlords weren't going to just give up on the illicit drugs trade. There's simply too much money to be made in it. Instead, they found a new drug to manufacture, methamphetamine.
Holy shit, that's a lot of drugs. Army, police, and being guarded very seriously. We're looking at $26 million worth of ketamine and yaba right here.
Meth is fundamentally a lot easier to produce than heroin. You can take small chemical precursors produced in China, they can cross over the border without detection, and then a few small laboratories can create enormous quantities of drugs that would bring you greater amount of profit than you would if you had thousands of acres of poppy fields.
And along with the opium and the growing of poppies, Afghanistan in its Golden Crescent, it now has become one of the largest opium-producing areas in the world, and that was since the 1950s. And most of the world's heroin came from the Golden Triangle until the early 21st century. And it was just after that that Afghanistan took over and became the world's largest producer. The majority of the region's heroin or opium now is actually grown and produced in Myanmar, and to a lesser extent, Laos. Yeah, it's always changing. But today, the biggest boom trade happening out of that same area, the Golden Triangle, and it's still reported to be a booming global narcotics hub, is the production and distribution of meth, a drug which is a lot easier to manufacture in bulk than heroin, which requires on poppies. Meth just requires base chemicals and some other things to mix up. So the earliest inhabitants of what is now known as Laos were the Mon Khmer people who lived in the area 3,000 years ago. They were followed by the Thai people who migrated from southern China and into Southeast Asia around 2,000 years ago. And the Thai people settled in now is what known as Laos and established a number of small city-states, and they were ruled by local chieftains. The first kingdom to emerge in Laos was the Khmer Empire, which ruled the region from the 9th to the 13th centuries. The Khmer Empire was based in what is now known as Cambodia, but extended its influence into Laos, Thailand, and also Vietnam. And during this period, the Khmers built a number of important temples and other structures in Laos, including the temple complex at Wat Phao, which is now a UNESCO heritage listed site. In the 14th century, the Khmer Empire began to decline, and a number of smaller kingdoms emerged in Laos. One of the most important of these kingdoms was the Kingdom of Lan Xang, which was founded in the 14th century by Phra Nagum. Phra Nagum was a prince from the Thai region of Muang Suar, which was located near modern-day Luang Prabang. He conquered a number of neighbouring city-states and established the Kingdom of Lan Xang, which became one of the most powerful states in all of Southeast Asia. And under the Kingdom of Lan Xang, Luang Prabang, which we'll see more of later, became an important centre for Buddhism.
Lan Xang never gained the level of economic prosperity of its Khmer and Thai neighbors, but it did have significant cultural and intellectual achievements of its own. The kingdom's elites were well renowned for their poetry, music, and Buddhist scholarship. Under Samson Thai's patronage, Buddhism became more entrenched as a state religion, and the construction of Buddhist temples and monuments became a significant undertaking.
And the city was home to a number of important monasteries and temples, including the Wat Siang Thong, which was built in the 16th century. And the city also became an important centre of trade and commerce, thanks to its strategic position along the mighty Mekong River. In the 18th century, the Kingdom of Lan Xang began to decline, and Luang Prabang became an independent kingdom. The city was ruled by a succession of monarchs who built a number of important structures, including the royal palace, and the city also became an important centre for trade and commerce. However, the city's isolation and lack of resources meant it remained relatively poor and undeveloped. During the 19th century, in the height of colonialism, when there was land grabs happening all over the world by the major European powers, Laos became a French protectorate, and Luang Prabang became part of the French colonial empire. And it's the whole era of French Indochina, because the French were not only in Laos, they also ruled Vietnam. They were a big force back then. It's hard to think of now, but their influence and presence is clearly visible when you travel to Luang Prabang, and you see the styles of French colonial architecture, which are still in mint conditions, and they're really remarkable. During World War II, Laos were occupied by the Japanese, who were allied with the French Vichy government. But after the war, the French returned to Laos, but they faced increasing resistance from the Lao people, who were now seeking independence. So in 1953, Laos became an independent kingdom, and Luang Prabang became the capital of the new country. In the years following independence, Laos was ruled by a series of authoritarian regimes, which were supported by the United States and other Western powers. After World War II, Laos became a battleground in the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union. And the country was, as I said, ruled by a number of authoritarian regimes, which were backed by the United States. And the most important of these regimes was the Kingdom of Laos, which is ruled by the royal family of Luang Prabang. The kingdom was established in 1953 after the French colonial authorities withdrew from the country, and the king of Luang Prabang, Sisavang Vong, was chosen to be the first monarch of the new country. The new government was dominated by the royal family and the military, and it was heavily influenced still by the ubiquitous United States. In the early years of the Kingdom of Laos, the government faced a number of challenges. The country was deeply divided among ethnic and regional lines, and there was significant opposition to the new government in many parts of the country. The government also faced a growing communist insurgency, which was supported by the Soviet Union and China. And in 1960, a coup d'etat led by a group of military officers overthrew the government and the Kingdom of Laos. The coup was supported by the United States, which saw the new government as more favourable to its interests. And the new government was led by General Thumi Nosaban, who was a close ally of the United States. The new government faced a number of challenges, including opposition from the communist forces and regional and ethnic divisions within the country. The United States provided significant military and economic aid to the new government, but the insurgency continued to grow. In 1964, the United States launched a secret bombing campaign against the communist forces in Laos, which lasted until 1973.
Between 1964 and 1973, the United States conducted a massive air war against Laos, dropping so many bombs as to make Laos, with its 2.5 million people, the most heavily bombed country in history. This was a secret war, in violation of the Geneva Accords, and kept secret from Congress and the American people. The most feared type of bomb used was a newly developed weapon known as a cluster bomb. An estimated 90 million cluster bombs were dropped on Laos. Many never exploded, leaving the countryside littered with millions of unexploded bombs, or bombies.
I'd read the figures, the 9 years of bombing, the tonnage, all the rest of it, but I'd never seen a landscape like that. It was unimaginable. I had never ever experienced anything on that scale from a technical point of view.
This bombing campaign was one of the largest in history, and it had a devastating impact on the country. It's estimated, if you can believe this number, that over 2 million tonnes of bombs were dropped on Laos, making it the most heavily bombed country in the history of humanity. The bombing campaign had a significant impact on the people of Laos, especially in the rural areas. Many farmers were forced to flee their homes, and many more were killed or injured. The bombing also had a long-term impact on the environment, as unexploded bombs continue to pose a threat to people in Laos even today. In the 1960s, the communist forces in Laos began to gain strength, thanks in part to the support from the Soviet Union and China. In 1975, the communist forces overthrew the government, the Kingdom of Laos, and established Laos People's Democratic Republic. The new government was aligned with the Soviet Union and China, and it pursued a socialist agenda. The new government faced a number of challenges, including opposition from ethnic and regional groups. The government launched a number of economic and social reforms, but progress was slow. In the 1980s, the government began to open up the country to foreign investment and trade. The government also began to pursue a more market-orientated economic policy, which led to significant economic growth. Today, Laos is one of the fastest growing economies in Southeast Asia, with a growing tourism industry and rapidly expanding manufacturing sector. Despite the economic progress, Laos remains one of the poorest countries in the region, with high levels of poverty and inequality. The country also faces a number of environmental challenges, including deforestation and water pollution. In modern times, Laos has made significant progress towards economic development and stability. The country's opened up to foreign investment and trade, and has pursued a market economy policy that's led to significant growth. Laos made progress towards political stability with a relatively stable government and a peaceful transition of power. The country has held regular elections, although the ruling party remains dominant. Opposition parties have been able to participate in the political process. Now, Laos has played an important role in regional politics, particularly in the context of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, ASEAN. The country's been an active participant in ASEAN since it joined the organisation in 1997 and has worked to promote regional cooperation and development. Laos played a role in international politics, particularly in the context of regional security and diplomacy, and it's maintained close ties with China and Russia and has brought to balance its relations with the United States and other Western powers. So in recent years, Laos has faced criticism from human rights groups and international organisations over its treatment of ethnic and religious minorities, as well as its restrictions on freedom of speech and assembly. The government responded to these criticisms by launching a number of initiatives aimed at improving human rights and promoting political openness. Overall, Laos has made significant progress in the recent years towards economic development and political stability. But the country still faces significant challenges in the areas of poverty and environmental conservation. Laos has the potential to continue its path towards a brighter future, and it's a country well worth visiting because it's spectacular.